In the spring of 2026, something unexpected happened at the box office. A sequel to a 19-year-old film about fashion magazines opened to over $76 million in its first weekend. The same four actors, the same director, the same writer, and audiences flooded back as if no time had passed at all. Critics were surprised. Industry analysts were surprised. Even some of the people involved in making it admitted they had not fully anticipated this kind of response. Sequels are common enough, and nostalgia is a reliable engine for ticket sales. But this felt like something more than nostalgia. It felt like unfinished business. Like a conversation that had been paused for 19 years and was now, finally, being resumed. But the audiences were not surprised at all, because they had never really left. The Devil Wears Prada had never been just a film you watched once and set aside. It was a film you returned to, sometimes years later, and found that it had somehow kept pace with you, that it was still asking the same questions you were still asking, even if everything around those questions had shifted and changed, that it knew something about you that you had not quite finished knowing about yourself. The best films do that. They do not age the way most things age. They travel with you. The Devil Wears Prada 2 is in cinemas right now, and its arrival made millions of people do the same thing, go back and re-watch the original, pull it up on a streaming service late at night, perhaps with something warm to drink, and let it wash over them like a memory they had not visited in years but had never quite released. Because there is something about that film that does not let you go, something that stays in the back of your mind long after the specific plot details have blurred and the exact lines of dialogue have faded, an image, a feeling, a question that keeps returning at inconvenient moments. In the middle of an ordinary workday, at the end of a long week when you are tired in a particular way that you recognize but cannot quite name. Tonight we are going to talk about that film, about where it came from, and what it was really saying underneath the glamour and the extraordinary clothes and the cutting one-liners that have passed into common speech, about the woman whose real experience inspired it and the woman whose performance made it something that will last a very long time, about the world of work that the film was born into, and the very different world of work that exists now, 2 decades later, and what it means that the same story reads so differently depending on when and where and who you are when you encounter it. About why, 19 years after it first appeared in cinemas, we are still asking the questions it was asking, and why those questions have, if anything, become more urgent rather than less. But first, get comfortable. Find your position. Let your body settle into wherever you are right now. Let this be the thing that quiets the noise of your day, because you have been carrying that noise for long enough already, and it will still be there in the morning if you need it. Whatever is unresolved, whatever is waiting, whatever you are still turning over in your mind, it can wait a little longer. You do not have to solve anything tonight. You do not have to figure anything out. You just have to be here, in this quiet, for a little while. If you enjoy this kind of storytelling, a like means more than you might realize for a small channel like this one. It helps these stories reach more people, and that matters more than I can easily explain in a sentence. And if you want more nights like this one, subscribing takes about 2 seconds and genuinely makes a difference to whether this continues and grows. Now let everything else go. We are going back to 2006, but to understand 2006, we have to go a few years further back than that, to a book, and before the book, to a young woman sitting at a desk in one of the most powerful offices in New York City, answering a phone that never stopped ringing, for a woman she was genuinely, quietly afraid of. Lauren Weisberger graduated from Cornell University in 1999. She was 22 years old. She wanted to be a writer, and she had, like most people who want to be writers at 22, very little money and a very strong feeling that she was meant for something, even if she had not yet worked out exactly what that something was, or how to travel from where she currently stood to wherever it actually lived. She moved to New York, which is what people with that particular combination of ambition and uncertainty tend to do, because New York is a city that takes both seriously and asks very difficult questions in return, and is entirely indifferent to whether you have answers. She looked for work. She sent applications and attended interviews and did all the things that young people with large ambitions and limited credentials do when they arrive in a city that is wholly indifferent to those ambitions. And eventually, through a combination of timing and persistence, and the particular kind of luck that looks like hard work from the outside but feels like falling through a door from the inside, she landed a job. Not just any job. A job that most people in her industry would have described, without qualification, as extraordinary. She became a personal assistant to Anna Wintour, the editor-in-chief of American Vogue, arguably the single most influential figure in global fashion, and one of the most powerful people in media. If you do not already have a clear picture of Anna Wintour, here is a brief one. She has been editor-in-chief of American Vogue since 1988, which means she has held that position for nearly 4 decades, an almost unimaginable tenure in an industry that consumes talent quickly and discards it faster. She is known for her signature blunt bob, her dark, oversized sunglasses worn in nearly every public context, regardless of lighting conditions, and a manner that has been described, depending on who you ask and how diplomatically they are choosing to speak in that particular moment, as either supremely professional or genuinely terrifying. Usually, if you press people hard enough, they will concede that both are true simultaneously, and that the two qualities are, in fact, not separable in her case. She is the kind of person who enters a room and changes its temperature without appearing to do anything at all. Weisberger worked for her for nearly a year. She answered phones and managed schedules and anticipated needs before they were expressed and solved problems before they had time to become crises, operating in a world of almost surreal precision, where the margin between acceptable and unacceptable was measured in the smallest possible increments, and where the consequences of getting something wrong were communicated not through raised voices. Raised voices would have been almost a relief, something concrete to absorb and respond to, but through silence, a particular kind of silence. Cold, complete, and somehow worse than anything louder could have been, because it gave you nothing to push back against. She was good at the job. She was also making herself thoroughly miserable doing it, in ways she could feel accumulating but could not easily articulate. There is a specific kind of misery that comes from being genuinely competent at something you do not want to be doing, and it is fundamentally different from the misery of failure. Failure, at least, gives you permission to leave, the sense that this was not suited to you, that moving on is the logical and self-respecting conclusion. Competence does not offer that permission. Competence traps you. You are good at it. You can do it. The path of least resistance is to keep going, and so you keep going, and you get a little better, and the trap becomes more comfortable without becoming, in any meaningful sense, less of a trap. When Weisberger finally left, she did what writers do when they need to process something they cannot fully understand while they are still inside it. She wrote about it. Not as journalism, she was careful about that, and would remain careful for years afterward when people asked direct questions. Not as a memoir, which would have required a kind of explicit accountability she was not prepared to take on. She wrote fiction. She changed the names and altered some of the details and created characters who were inspired by real people but were not, legally or literally, those people. The magazine became Runway. The formidable editor became Miranda Priestly. The overwhelmed assistant trying to survive in an environment she had not been prepared for became Andrea Sachs, who went by Andy. The Devil Wears Prada was published in April 2003 and became a bestseller almost immediately. The interesting thing about its success is not just how many people bought it, but why they bought it. They were not all interested in fashion. Many of them had never been anywhere near a magazine office, but they recognized something in the central dynamic of the story, the impossible boss, the assistant who must perform competence and gratitude simultaneously in conditions that make both difficult, the unspoken contract that says your time and your energy, and sometimes your basic dignity, belong entirely to the person above you, and that questioning this is itself a form of insufficient commitment, and they felt seen by it in a way that surprised many of them. Someone had named something they had been living through but had not had the precise language for. That is a powerful thing for a book to do. Hollywood came calling within months of publication. The film rights were acquired. A screenplay was commissioned from writer Aline Brosh McKenna, and the work began of taking a novel set in a very specific and rarefied world and finding within it something universal enough to speak to audiences far beyond that world. McKenna made a crucial decision early in the process. She would protect the ambiguity of the material. The book is somewhat more directly critical of Miranda. She is the obstacle, the thing to be survived and eventually escaped. McKenna kept Miranda as the structural antagonist, but gave her a coherence and an internal logic that transformed what kind of story this could become. In the film, you do not have to like Miranda, but you understand her. You understand the logic of her, and that understanding is what gives the story its durability across nearly 2 decades of changing cultural context. The question of who would play Miranda Priestly became the decision that would define everything else about the finished film. The role could so easily have become a cartoon, the cold, impossible woman, the villain who exists to be feared and then ultimately defeated, the obstacle in someone else's journey towards self-discovery and self-actualization. That version of the character is not interesting. It evaporates from memory almost immediately after the credits roll. You have seen it in 100 films and remembered none of them. Meryl Streep took the role and did something that genuinely surprised many people who had read the book and thought they knew exactly what was coming. She made Miranda quiet. This was a deliberate, deeply counterintuitive choice. In her own preparation for the role and in conversations with director David Frankel, Streep decided that Miranda would never raise her voice. She would never shout. She would never perform her power, because people who truly possess power, who have held it for a very long time and have long since stopped needing to prove it to anyone, do not perform it. They simply exercise it. Quietly, with absolute precision, without drama. Miranda speaks in a near whisper throughout the entire film. She turns away while people are still in the middle of addressing her. She delivers what are effectively career-ending assessments in the same calm tone she might use to comment on the weather outside. And this absolute stillness, this total refusal to be in any way dramatic about her own very considerable cruelty, is what makes her genuinely, lastingly unsettling in a way that any amount of shouting could never have achieved. Streep has spoken in interviews about how she developed the character. She said she thought about what it would actually feel like to be someone who has been doing an extraordinarily demanding job at the absolute highest possible level, for decade after decade, the bone-deep tiredness that would accumulate underneath the surface precision, the weight of always being the person in the room who must decide, the particular loneliness of operating at a level where very few other people can actually meet you. She gave Miranda a vulnerability that the script did not explicitly require, but that the performance needed desperately in order to work. Not a vulnerability that invites your sympathy. Miranda would find the offer insulting and would dismiss it without a second thought, but one that makes her recognizable as a human being. As a person who made choices a long time ago and has been living with their full weight ever since, every single day, without ever quite being able to set them down and rest. Anne Hathaway played Andy with a quality that is essential to the film's success and not easily described in simple terms. A kind of open-faced intelligence. A person who is clearly capable of more than her circumstances are currently asking of her, but who has not yet fully learned how to deploy that capability in a world that is not always interested in it on her terms. Emily Blunt played Emily, the senior assistant, in only her second significant film role, and found a way to make her both genuinely funny and genuinely sympathetic. A person who has absorbed the values of her professional world so thoroughly and over such a long time that she can no longer see them as values at all. They are simply reality to her, the way things inevitably and correctly are. Stanley Tucci played Nigel, the art director, and gave the character a warmth and a carefully managed melancholy that the film badly needed. Someone who has made a kind of peace with his own accommodations and found a way to love the world he inhabits, even when it does not always love him back in equivalent measure. The film was made for roughly $40 million. It opened in June 2006 and went on to gross nearly $300 million worldwide. It received 2 Academy Award nominations, turned Emily Blunt into a household name overnight, and entered the culture in a way that very few films manage, not merely as something people had seen and might recommend, but as a shared reference point, a common language, a shorthand for describing something true and specific about work and ambition, and the particular peculiar cost of wanting things very badly, in a world that is perfectly willing to let you pay whatever price it decides to name. So what is The Devil Wears Prada actually about at its core? What is it really doing underneath the surface of fashion shoots and impossible demands and the cutting one-liners that people are still deploying in conversation nearly 2 decades after the film was made? On the surface, it is a recognizable kind of story. A young woman enters a world she did not choose or plan for, finds herself slowly transformed by it in ways she did not anticipate and does not entirely welcome, and eventually must make a conscious choice about who she actually wants to be. Identity under pressure, the true cost of ambition, the difficulty of knowing yourself in an environment designed to reshape you. These are familiar themes, and the film deploys them with real skill, but it is doing something more honest and ultimately more uncomfortable than those familiar themes alone would suggest. Andy Sachs arrives at Runway with a very clear and firmly held idea of herself. She is not a fashion person. She is a serious person, a journalist, or at least intends to be one, which in her mind amounts to essentially the same thing. She looks at the world of Runway with barely concealed contempt, and the film is careful and precise enough to show us that this attitude, while entirely understandable on a human level, is also a form of arrogance, a way of not having to take seriously something she has simply not bothered to understand. The film is not entirely on Andy's side. It is telling a story about a smart woman who gradually discovers that her settled sense of her own superiority was itself a limitation, that the things she dismissed so easily as trivial and shallow were only trivial and shallow because she had never taken the trouble to actually look at them. The scene that makes this argument most memorably and most permanently is the cerulean belt scene, which has been analyzed and written about more than almost any other scene in mainstream cinema of its era. Miranda is choosing between 2 nearly identical belts for a fashion shoot, and Andy allows herself a small private smile at what appears to be the evident absurdity of the level of attention being devoted to something apparently so minor and inconsequential. Miranda notices the smile immediately. What follows is one of the most quietly devastating monologues in mainstream cinema of the last 20 years. Miranda traces the provenance of the cerulean blue sweater Andy is wearing, chosen seemingly at random from a discount pile at some point in the past, through the entire chain of decisions that caused it to exist, the fashion house that originated the color on a runway, the editors and publications that covered it and gave it cultural weight, the retail buyers who ordered it at scale, the manufacturers who produced it in volume, the stores that eventually marked it down when demand faded, the discount bin where Andy found it without thinking. Andy believes she opted out of the fashion system entirely. Miranda explains with complete patience that she has been swimming in it all along, and that the only difference between the two of them, in this precise moment, is that Miranda can see the water. This is a radical argument dressed elegantly in the language of a scene ostensibly about belt selection. It is an argument against the illusion of neutrality, the comfortable idea that you can simply stand outside a cultural system by refusing to consciously engage with it. The system does not require your conscious engagement. It shapes you regardless of whether you pay attention to it or not. The only question available to you is whether you participate with awareness, or whether you mistake your own unconscious participation for a kind of principled independence and call that mistake a virtue. This point extends very far beyond fashion, into nearly every domain where cultural power moves invisibly through people who are entirely certain that they are immune to its influence. Andy begins, slowly and somewhat reluctantly, to participate with awareness. The famous transformation montage, extraordinary clothes, a different posture, a new way of moving through the spaces she inhabits, is almost universally read as a makeover scene, as a visual representation of corruption or compromise. It is more accurately a scene about language acquisition. Andy is not becoming a different person. She is learning to speak a language she previously refused to learn, and discovering in the process that fluency in it changes how you see everything, including yourself. She gets good at the job. Noticeably, impressively, undeniably good. She anticipates needs before they are expressed. She finds solutions others cannot locate. She earns, if not warmth, from Miranda. Warmth is simply not a register Miranda operates in with anyone. Something that functions like recognition. The sense that she has been seen and assessed and found to be genuinely capable. That she is not just another replaceable body occupying the assistant chair. As Andy gets better at the job, she gets progressively worse at her life outside it. The hours are impossible, and she keeps them without visible complaint. Her boyfriend Nate feels increasingly sidelined by something he cannot fully name or compete with. Her old friends feel abandoned. She misses small things that cannot be recovered. A birthday, a dinner, moments that matter to people she loves. And she keeps going, because the job requires it, and she has, somewhere along the way without fully noticing it happening, decided that the job is what matters most. And then comes the moment the film presents as the true and irreversible turning point, the moment that changes the moral weight of everything that came before it. Nigel, her friend, her guide through an unfamiliar world, the person who was kind to her when she was genuinely lost and frightened, is about to walk directly into a trap. Andy knows exactly what is coming. She says absolutely nothing. She lets it happen. She protects Miranda and herself and sacrifices Nigel in the process. It is not a dramatic betrayal. There is no confrontation. No obvious theatrical moment of choosing wrong over right. It is small and quiet and entirely in keeping with how these things actually happen in real workplaces, not through grand gestures of moral corruption, but through small pragmatic silences, through the daily, incremental decision not to make things harder for yourself when looking the other way costs you nothing visible in the immediate moment. In Paris, at what feels like the end of the film's second act, Miranda tells Andy something that reframes everything that has come before. She says that she sees herself in her, that Andy is just like her, willing to do what needs to be done, willing to allow other people to bear the cost of her decisions without allowing that cost to slow her down or change her direction. It is the highest compliment Miranda knows how to give. It is the only kind of recognition she has to offer. Andy receives it as a horror. She looks at Miranda, at the loneliness that surrounds her, like a permanent climate she has long since stopped noticing. At the two daughters she barely sees. At the husband she is in the process of losing. At the empire she has built entirely from scratch and rules over absolutely, and which is somehow, inexplicably, still not enough for her. And she thinks, is this where this road ends? Is this what the road leads to? Is this what she is in the process of becoming, decision by decision, compromise by compromise? She throws the phone in the fountain. She walks away. The film does not entirely celebrate this choice, which is one of the things that makes it honest. It shows you Andy rebuilding, returning to her relationships, finding journalism work that is more aligned with who she actually wants to be, recovering something of herself that she had been in the process of losing. The return to the self, the refusal to become the thing she was being shaped into. But the film also shows you Miranda in the car, watching Andy go. And on Meryl Streep's face in that final moment of connection between the two women, there is something that absolutely resists easy naming. It is not contempt. It is not admiration. It is something more like recognition, as if Miranda sees in Andy's departure an echo of a road that was perhaps once available to her too, a very long time ago, before other choices foreclosed it. The film gives you both of these women, fully and generously, and asks you to decide which one you recognize in yourself. It does not tell you the answer. It has too much respect for the genuine difficulty of the question to pretend there is an easy one. And that refusal, that decision to leave the most important question genuinely, uncomfortably open, is what makes it last. To understand why The Devil Wears Prada resonated the way it did in 2006, you have to understand what the culture of work looked like in that specific moment, and what stories the culture was telling itself about what work meant and what it was for. The millennial generation, broadly, people born between the early 1980s and the mid to 1990s, were either just entering the workforce or preparing to do so. They had been raised on a specific, coherent, and widely shared set of promises. Study hard, get a good degree, work hard once you are there, prove yourself through sustained effort and sacrifice, and the future will reward you for all of it. The rewards were not always specified in precise detail, but they were implied strongly enough that most people believed in them and structured their early adult lives around them. The entry-level job in this cultural framework was a form of dues-paying, a ritual of earning your right to be taken seriously, of demonstrating through sustained effort and endurance that you were capable of more than you had yet been given the opportunity to prove. You were supposed to struggle. You were supposed to encounter difficulty and push through it without complaint, because that was how you demonstrated that you were serious, that you were committed, that you wanted it badly enough to deserve it. A demanding boss, in this worldview, was not a sign that something was wrong with the environment. It was a sign that you were somewhere that mattered, where the standards were genuinely high, where you were being held to something worth being held to. The culture of total availability, the expectation that your time beyond your contracted hours was a reasonable thing for your employer to claim, that being always reachable and always responsive was a professional virtue rather than an unreasonable imposition, was not just accepted in competitive industries. It was celebrated and actively modeled. The person who left precisely at 6 was the person who did not really care. The person who answered messages at midnight was demonstrating commitment. The inability to maintain a clear boundary between your professional self and your personal life was not a warning sign about your well-being. It was a credential that demonstrated your seriousness. There was an entire vocabulary built around this understanding of professional life, and it was deployed constantly and without irony. Paying your dues. Earning your stripes. Nobody said it would be easy. You have to want it. The implicit argument threaded through all of it was that the people who could not handle the difficulty simply did not want it enough. We're not serious enough. We're not the right kind of person for the right kind of work. The suffering was not incidental to the career. It was constitutive of it. It demonstrated something real about you. That you could absorb pressure without cracking. That you could subordinate your immediate comfort to a longer-term goal. That you could be trusted with something important precisely because you had already shown you could endure something genuinely hard. Miranda Priestly, watched through this cultural lens, is not a villain. She is a teacher, an extraordinarily demanding, unforgiving, sometimes genuinely cruel teacher, but a teacher nonetheless. Someone who transmits something real through the difficulty of her demands. Her standards are impossibly high because the work she does genuinely requires impossibly high standards. Her expectations are exhausting because excellence is exhausting. You come out the other side of working for Miranda either broken by the experience or fundamentally formed by it, and the people who come out formed are the ones who matter, the ones who go on to do something. Emily has absorbed this framework so completely and over such a long time that she simply can no longer see it as a framework at all. It is not a set of values she holds. It is reality. And the film is careful enough not to entirely mock her for this, because Emily is doing exactly what an entire culture told her to do, and she is its most sincere and most loyal believer. Millennial viewers in 2006 watched The Devil Wears Prada and recognized their own professional lives in it with an intimacy that surprised many of them, not because they worked in fashion specifically, but because they recognized the underlying dynamic in their own industries, their own offices, their own daily experience. The boss whose full approval was always a fraction out of reach, always slightly conditional, always requiring something more. The hours that bled into personal time without acknowledgement or thanks. The unspoken understanding that the job would take whatever you offered, and that offering more than was strictly required was what distinguished the people who were going somewhere from the people who were not. Miranda Priestly became a shorthand, a piece of shared language, and it was not always deployed as a complaint. Sometimes it was almost a boast. If your boss was a Miranda, you were somewhere serious. You were being held to something. The difficulty was the proof. Somewhere between 2006 and today, the water changed. It changed slowly at first, and then with increasing and eventually unmistakable speed, the way most significant cultural changes do, underground for years before they become visible, and then suddenly impossible to ignore. The first major fracture was the financial crisis of 2008. For the older millennials who were just beginning to establish themselves professionally, when the crisis hit, this was a rupture in the social contract that had structured their entire understanding of how professional life was supposed to function. They had done everything they were supposed to do. They had studied. They had worked hard. They had paid their dues and proved their commitment and subordinated their personal needs to professional demands. And the system revealed, plainly and without much ceremony, that it had never actually agreed to the terms everyone thought they had signed up for. Companies that had demanded total loyalty let their people go in enormous numbers. The dues had been paid. The reward turned out not to have been what anyone had assumed it was purchasing. This introduced a skepticism about the implicit promises of professional life that a significant portion of the millennial generation had not previously held, and that skepticism never fully went away. It went underground as the economy gradually recovered, and people rebuilt their careers within the structures that were available to them. But it remained there, underneath everything, changing how people thought about their relationship to their employers in ways that would not become fully visible until the next rupture came. The pandemic beginning in 2020 was the next rupture, and it was larger and stranger than anything that had come before it. It forced a question that most people had genuinely never been asked to seriously consider. What is the office actually for, in functional terms? What is physical presence at a workplace actually purchasing as a transaction between employer and employee? What if you stripped away all the accumulated performance and ritual and convention that surrounded professional life, was actually required to do most jobs effectively? For a very large number of people across a very wide range of industries, the answer turned out to be considerably less than they had been led to believe over many years. The performative elements of professional life, being seen to arrive early, being seen to stay late, occupying professional space, and being visibly present and visibly available, turned out to be meaningfully separable from the actual content of most work. The ritual had been treated as a practical necessity for so long that the distinction between the ritual and the substance had been entirely forgotten by nearly everyone. When restrictions finally lifted and employers began calling their people back, many employees found they genuinely did not want to return. Not to the physical spaces specifically, but to the logic those spaces had come to embody. The logic of presence as proof of commitment. The logic of availability as professional virtue. The logic of the job as an entity with a legitimate claim on all the hours and all the energy you possessed, rather than specifically the hours and energy you had agreed to provide in exchange for specific compensation. The concept of quiet quitting emerged publicly in the summer of 2022 and became a cultural flashpoint almost immediately, which is always the sign that a term has successfully named something already widespread that was looking for a label to make it visible and discussable. The concept was not about minimal effort or deliberate underperformance. It was about doing your job well, but stopping the additional performance of devotion you did not actually feel. It was about drawing a real and defensible line between your professional self and your personal self, and holding that line. The reaction from older generations, from management theorists, from the business press, was swift and largely predictable. This was laziness dressed up in the language of philosophy and self-care. This was entitlement masquerading as principle. This was precisely the kind of thinking that Miranda Priestly would never have tolerated for a single moment, and which she would have found not just unproductive but morally objectionable, which is, of course, the entire point. That is exactly the framework the quiet quitting generation was consciously pushing back against. The idea that dues exist to be paid indefinitely as a condition of employment, that suffering is inherently and permanently virtuous, that the correct and admirable response to unreasonable demands is to simply meet them, because meeting them is how you demonstrate your fitness to be there. General Z had grown up watching millennials navigate this system. They had watched their older counterparts work themselves to the edges of exhaustion and beyond, accumulate impressive professional credentials, sacrifice years of personal time and personal life and personal health, and they had seen the returns on that investment fall consistently short of what had been implied when the investment was made. The loyalty had not reliably flowed in both directions. The promotions had not always materialized on the timeline that had been suggested. The stability that was supposed to be the reward for years of sacrifice had proven more conditional and fragile than advertised. They had also grown up with something their predecessors had not had in the same accessible form: a mainstream, widely available language for talking about what chronic overwork actually does to a human being over an extended period of time. The conversation about burnout moved from the margins of self-help culture into the center of public discourse. The World Health Organization formally classified burnout as an occupational phenomenon in 2019. Mental health professionals used social media to explain in plain and accessible language exactly what sustained workplace stress does to a nervous system across years and decades of accumulation. The idea that struggling was evidence of character failing gave way, gradually and then decisively, to the idea that struggling might be information about the environment rather than about the individual caught inside it. Gen Z looked at Miranda Priestly and did not see what their millennial predecessors had seen. They did not see a harsh but ultimately admirable teacher. They did not see someone embodying the necessary and inevitable price of genuine excellence. They saw someone who had been actively permitted by a culture that had spent decades romanticizing suffering and valorizing hierarchy as evidence of meritocracy, to treat other human beings as instruments to be deployed rather than as people with their own legitimate needs and limits and dignities. They saw a workplace abuser, and they saw a system that had been carefully and deliberately constructed over a long period of time to make that abuse feel not just normal and acceptable but aspirational, something to be grateful for rather than protected against. This is not a small or incremental shift in perspective. It is a shift in the underlying moral framework through which work itself is understood and evaluated. The question is no longer simply whether Miranda's behavior is reasonable or proportionate. The question is, how did a culture construct the precise conditions in which this behavior came to seem not merely acceptable but admirable? What values had to be firmly in place for this framing to hold? And are those values ones that anyone would consciously choose to rebuild and reinstate if they examined them honestly and in full daylight? If The Devil Wears Prada were being made today, it would be a meaningfully different film from the one made in 2006. The ambiguity that the original version could afford to maintain around Miranda, the sense that she is extraordinarily difficult and perhaps genuinely cruel but ultimately might be justified, that her demands are excessive but also perhaps revelatory, would be considerably harder to sustain for a contemporary audience bringing contemporary questions. The film would be required to take clear positions it could previously afford to leave productively open. And this is exactly the challenge, and the opportunity facing The Devil Wears Prada 2, which arrives in a world that has substantially revised its collective assessment of Miranda Priestly, and in which Miranda herself must now navigate an industry that has changed significantly around her. Print media contracting, advertising revenue dispersed across platforms she did not build and cannot fully control, cultural authority no longer concentrated in the specific places where she spent decades constructing and maintaining her power. Her position was always partly genuinely earned, and partly a shared agreement about who got to define what mattered and what did not. Shared agreements can be renegotiated. Shared agreements, under the right conditions, can be withdrawn entirely. So why do we keep returning to this particular film? Across 19 years, and through all the cultural changes those years contain. I think it is because The Devil Wears Prada is genuinely honest about something that the vast majority of stories about professional life are not honest about. Most stories about work resolve. They find a conclusion that allows the audience to leave the theater feeling that something has been decided. The protagonist succeeds, she earns her place, receives the recognition she deserved all along, proves herself on her own terms. Or she escapes. She realizes the system is wrong for her specifically. She walks away. She finds something more authentic and more human on the other side of the difficult decision. Both of these resolutions are satisfying to watch. Both of them are also incomplete in ways that the film refuses to paper over. The Devil Wears Prada refuses either resolution fully. Andy walks away, but the film does not give you a clean, uncomplicated triumph. It gives you an ambiguous departure and something genuinely unnameable on Miranda's face in the final shared moment between them. And it leaves both women unfinished, still navigating, still living with the weight of choices whose full meaning has not yet revealed itself. That is deeply uncomfortable to sit with. The discomfort, I would argue, is precisely the point. Most of us, if we are fully honest, contain something of both of these women. We want the work to mean something. We want to be genuinely good at it, to be recognized for what we contribute to it, to feel the specific and irreplaceable satisfaction that comes from doing something genuinely difficult at a high level and knowing that you did. And we also want our lives. We want the people who matter to us to feel that they matter. We want to be actually present for the things that do not appear on any professional calendar and cannot be rescheduled. We want to know that when we eventually look back at how we spent our finite time and our finite energy, the professional will not have consumed and replaced what was supposed to surround it. These two things are not easily reconciled. Anyone who says they have fully and permanently reconciled them is either extraordinarily lucky or not quite being honest about the cost. The film does not pretend otherwise. It holds both of them in the same frame, at full weight, and asks you to remain with the genuine difficulty of that. There is also something in the film about the nature of excellence itself that has not dated and seems unlikely to date. Miranda Priestly is genuinely, undeniably, recognizably excellent at what she does. Whatever you think of her methods or her personal qualities, whatever conclusions you reach about the price she has paid and the price she has extracted from the people around her, she has built something real through decades of sustained and unrelenting effort. The film does not ask you to dismiss this. It asks you to hold it alongside everything else, alongside the loneliness, the cost, the collateral damage, the self that may have been gradually traded away in the service of the work, and to think seriously and honestly about what excellence actually requires. Whether excellence requires what Miranda has paid. Whether there is a version of it available that costs less. Whether that version is genuinely accessible or merely a consoling story. Whether we are all still, in our different ways, and at our different stages of life, working out the honest answer to that question for ourselves. The Devil Wears Prada sits at the center of this conversation because it arrived at a moment when the conversation was at a significant inflection point, and because it was honest enough about the genuine complexity of the questions to remain relevant as the conversation evolved and changed shape around it. It is a film about the world of high fashion. It is also a film about every world where someone young and capable finds themselves sharing a room with someone powerful and unsparing, and must figure out, not in a single dramatic moment of decision, but slowly, incrementally, in the accumulation of countless small daily choices, what they are willing to become in order to belong there. That is not a niche professional situation. That is a nearly universal human one. And that universality is why, 19 years after it first appeared, the film still lands with precisely the force it always had. Miranda Priestly watches Andy walk away across a Parisian street, and something moves across her face in that moment. Recognition, perhaps, the recognition of something familiar in the shape of the departure, or something closer to grief, quickly and expertly controlled, folded back immediately into the absolute stillness she has cultivated over decades of practice. Because controlling things quickly and completely is what Miranda does and has always done, and will continue doing. She turns back to her car. She keeps moving forward as she has always kept moving forward. The world of runway continues exactly as it always has, without hesitation or visible acknowledgement of anything lost. And Andy keeps walking, away from the fountain, away from the phone lying on the bottom of it, away from the version of herself she had been in the process of becoming, into a life she has chosen with full awareness of what she is choosing and what she is leaving behind. Toward something she has not yet fully articulated or defined, but that feels, for the first time in a long time, unmistakably and completely like her own. Both of them disappear from the frame. The film ends. The question stays. Which one are you? That is all for tonight. I hope this gave you something to think about, and perhaps something to let go of too. The questions this film asks have never been easy ones, and there is genuinely no shame in sitting with them unresolved. Some questions are not problems to be solved and then set down. They are things to be carried and slowly turned over, and returned to at different moments across a life, when they mean something slightly different from what they meant the last time you visited them. This film has been doing that for 19 years. I think it will keep doing it for a long time yet. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely and completely. A like, a comment, a subscription, any of it means more than you might think for a small channel like this one. It is how these stories find the people they are meant to find. It is how this continues. Sleep well. Take care of yourself. I will see you in the next one. The fashion world that The Devil Wears Prada depicts is, in some important respects, a heightened version of something more general. Every industry has its Miranda Priestlys, its figures who have achieved dominance through genuine talent combined with a complete absence of interest in the comfort of the people around them. Every profession has its version of the dues-paying culture, the expectation that suffering now is the price of recognition later, the implicit understanding that your needs as a person are secondary to your usefulness as a resource. Fashion simply makes this dynamic visible in a particularly theatrical and photogenic way. The clothes are gorgeous. The offices are beautiful. The power dynamics are exactly what you find everywhere, dressed in Prada. What the film does with unusual skill is refuse to let either of its central characters be simply right or simply wrong about the choices they make. Andy is not a pure heroine. Her condescension toward the world she enters is presented as a flaw, not a virtue. Her eventual sacrifice of Nigel is not excused by the circumstances that produce it. Even her departure from Runway, which the film clearly endorses on some level, is not presented as a triumph without complication, because Miranda's quiet recognition in the car suggests that walking away is its own kind of loss, its own kind of choosing. And Miranda is not simply a villain. Her excellence is real. Her loneliness is real. The choices that produced her current life were once made by someone younger, someone who perhaps did not fully understand what they were agreeing to trade away. This refusal to simplify is the film's most important quality, and it is surprisingly rare. Most stories about ambitious people in difficult environments eventually reveal themselves to be about whether ambition is good or bad, whether the system is worth engaging with or worth escaping. The Devil Wears Prada refuses this binary. It says, the ambition is real, and the system is real, and the cost is real, and the choice is genuinely difficult, and you will make it under conditions of incomplete information, and you will live with the consequences, and the consequences will be complicated. And that is simply what it is to be a person who wants things in a world that does not particularly care what you want. There is also something worth saying about the specific moment in the history of women and work that the film arrived in. The early 2000s were a time when the question of what professional success was supposed to look like for women was being actively, sometimes anxiously, renegotiated. The generation before had fought for the right to enter professional spaces on equal terms. The generation that followed had inherited those spaces, but was discovering that the terms remained subtly unequal in ways that were difficult to name, and therefore difficult to address. Miranda Priestly, in this context, can be read as a woman who achieved professional dominance by mastering the rules of a system that was not designed with her in mind, and who in the process became, in certain important respects, indistinguishable from the system itself. Whether that represents a victory or a particular kind of defeat is a question the film leaves carefully open. The relationship between Andy and Miranda is not the only important relationship in the film, and spending too long on it alone would miss some of what makes the story work. Nigel is essential, not just as the person Andy eventually sacrifices, but as a model of a different relationship to the same world. Nigel has been at Runway for a long time. He is deeply talented and clearly undervalued in certain respects. He has made accommodations that the film acknowledges cost him something real, and yet he is not bitter. He has found a way to love what he does and to find genuine pleasure in it, even under conditions that are not always fair or kind to him. He is, in some ways, the most psychologically interesting character in the film, the person who has found the most sustainable way of inhabiting a world that makes sustainability difficult. Emily occupies a different position. She is the cautionary tale that the film is kind enough not to label as such. She believes completely in the value of what she does and the importance of doing it perfectly. She has subordinated everything else to that belief. She is, by her own lights, exactly who she should be, and the film treats this with a mixture of comedy and quiet respect that prevents it from becoming cruel. Emily is not a fool. She is a person who took the available framework seriously and applied it with total consistency. The problem is not her intelligence or her commitment. The problem is the framework. The clothes deserve a brief mention, because they are not just decoration. The costume design in The Devil Wears Prada supervised by Patricia Field, is one of the most purposeful and narratively integrated in modern film. Andy's early outfits are deliberately, almost aggressively ordinary, not ugly exactly, but invisible, the clothes of someone who has decided that caring about clothes is beneath her. As she transforms, the clothes transform around her, more precise, more considered, more capable of communicating intention. And in the final scenes, when Andy walks away from runway, she's wearing something that is still elegant but differently so, confident in a way that is no longer about performing, belonging to a world she was not sure she deserved to inhabit. The clothes tell the story of a person learning and then choosing, which is the film's story too. The city of New York is worth mentioning as well. The film uses the city the way the best New York films do, not as a backdrop, but as an active element, a place with its own personality and demands and particular brand of indifference. The specific New York the film depicts, the New York of fashion and ambition, and the particular pressure of being young and capable in a city that will grind you down without noticing, is recognizable to anyone who has spent time in that environment. And it is also, in the way that specific places in fiction often become, a version of everywhere. Every city where people go to prove something to themselves and discover in the process that the city was not waiting for them and never will be, and that this is both terrifying and in some way exactly what they came for. It is worth pausing, somewhere near the end of this, to think about what the sequel's existence tells us. 19 years is a long time to wait for a follow-up. The original film did not obviously demand one. It ended, if not definitively, then at least with a kind of completeness, both women having arrived somewhere new. The decision to return to this world now, in 2026, with a story about Miranda facing obsolescence in a changed industry, suggests that the people who made it recognized something important, that the questions the first film was asking have not been resolved by time, but have instead become more urgent, more present, more unavoidable. The world of work has changed enough in 19 years that the same story, told from slightly different angles, becomes a different kind of argument about different kinds of things. The sequel is not nostalgia. It is the first film having a conversation with the present, and the present, it turns out, has a great deal to say back. We live now in a moment when the relationship between people and their work is being renegotiated in real time, in ways that are messy and contested and not yet resolved. The old framework, sacrifice now, earn your place, the job takes what it needs and you are grateful for the opportunity, is not gone. It persists in many industries, many offices, many professional cultures, but it is no longer the only available story. There are now other stories, told with increasing confidence and increasing visibility, stories about sustainable work, about boundaries, about the difference between dedication and self-destruction, about the right to be a whole person while also being good at your job. These stories are in conflict with the older ones. The conflict is ongoing and sometimes uncomfortable, and is not going to resolve quickly or cleanly. The Devil Wears Prada, watching from 19 years away, has something to say about all of it.